Welcome to the Ticktective podcast, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Dana Parrish, and I'm the co-author of the book Chronic, and I sit on the advisory board of Bay Area Lyme Foundation. This program offers insightful interviews with scientists, clinicians, patients, and other interesting people. We're a nonprofit based in Silicon Valley, and thanks to a generous grant that covers 100% of our overhead, all of your donations go directly to our research and prevention programs. For more information about Lyme disease, please visit us at bayarealyme.org. Hi, I'm Dana Parrish, and I'm thrilled today to welcome Dr. Raina MacIntyre. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Raina MacIntyre, MBBS, is head of the Biosecurity Program, Kirby Institute, UNSW. She leads research on prevention epidemic infections, including EpiWatch, an AI-driven early warning system for serious outbreaks. She has over 450 peer-reviewed publications. She's received many awards, including the Sir Henry Wellcome Medal from the Association of Military Surgeons of the U.S. She was on a U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine Pandemic Consensus Committee, and she's a member of WHO's COVID-19 Vaccine Composition Technical Advisory Group and WHO Smallpox and Monkeypox Working Group. Wow, you've been busy, 450 publications, and I am really pleased to have met you through this new nonprofit that we're both a part of called Biosafety Now. You know, it's an honor to be able to learn from you and meet you, and I'd love to talk a little bit about your background and what does it mean to be a biosecurity expert and an MD and a PhD in your area of expertise?
Sure. I started out my career as a medical doctor, and I was going to be a cardiologist because I've done a lot of cardiology in my specialist physician training and wanted to do cardiology, but I was also interested in epidemiology. So I saw an ad for this Master of Applied Epidemiology, which is the Australian Field Epidemiology Training Program, which is a type of hands-on training in outbreak investigation that was pioneered by the US CDC called the Epidemic Intelligence Services. And in some countries, when you do it, you get a degree. So I decided to do that degree, and it was quite life-changing for me because it was a new way of learning where you do just short bursts of classroom learning, but then you go out in the field, you investigate outbreaks, and you apply the learning that you had in the classroom to practical problems in the field where you're investigating outbreaks, trying to work out, what is this, where did it start, how can it be stopped, and so on. And then from that, I just went into a PhD in tuberculosis control because I developed this interest in infectious diseases. I finished my specialist physician training as well, and then did physician training in public health as well. So worked clinically for a while in a hospital in Melbourne in Australia, where I was the clinical work was focusing on tuberculosis, so looking after people with TB, and that was I really enjoyed being a clinician researcher, but then just circumstances, mainly my getting pregnant with my first child, resulted in me moving back to Sydney because my family was there, my parents were there, and I had more support in terms of career and child rearing. The circumstances just never presented to do a combined clinical research job. So I went into a full-time job at the eventually in the National Centre for Immunisation Research, which was in one of the big teaching hospitals in Sydney. So it was a non-clinical role working on vaccine research and policy. So I was affiliated with that centre for 15 years. So I've got quite a deep understanding of vaccines, did several vaccine clinical trials, but I was always interested in more than just vaccines. And during that time, I did several studies on face mask research, which actually became quite pivotal during the COVID pandemic because it's been an under-researched area and a very controversial area. And then in 2008, I moved to my current university, the University of New South Wales, spent 10 years as a head of school of a big school of public health, which still continued my research, including some of my most important face mask trials, but also had a big administrative load, managing a big teaching school, and then moved into a full-time research-only position in 2018. Which really allowed me to build on the research I'd done until that time in a more full-time way. And that was at the Kirby Institute, which is a infectious disease institute that had previously focused pretty much on HIV, bloodborne viruses and STIs. So my area of research was a little bit different, what had been going on there, because my focus had always been epidemic and emerging infections. And yeah, that's allowed us to do a lot more interesting stuff and build up some of the things I talk about in my book.
Yeah.
Biosecurity, sorry, I forgot to say how I became interested in that. When very long time ago, maybe in 2006, I was on a committee for the government that was looking at how do we stockpile for different biological events, bioterrorism, biowarfare, etc. And obviously, the diseases of interest were the Category A bioterrorism agents like smallpox, anthrax, etc. And, this was soon after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks in the US. So everyone was quite focused on anthrax, but I was sort of thinking and looking only at the probability of an attack and not looking at anything else. And I felt that was not I thought you needed a more of a matrix style, risk analysis style approach to thinking about these kind of threats. And so I did a piece of work that ended up, winning that award that you mentioned. And that kind of sparked my interest in smallpox particularly, but other biological weapons as well. And since then, I've done a lot of research on smallpox, on the re-emergence of smallpox and what that would look like, what, sort of public health measures could be used to control it and so on. And then I was obviously following the gain of function debate very closely when it first started in 2011. And that just really sparked my interest in dual use research of concern and gain of function research. And I started researching and publishing on that topic at that time. And, was warning, by 2015, I published a paper warning that the risk of an unnatural pandemic was much higher than the risk of a natural one. And yeah, that's how I got into the biosecurity side of things.
For people who are new to the subject of gain of function, can you explain what it means?
Yeah, so the broader umbrella term is dual use research of concern, which is research that can be used, that's intended for good, but can also be used for harm. And that applies to any science. It could be robotics, AI, drones, and biological research. Mm-hmm. Within the category of dual use research of concern, there's gain of function research. The two big categories are synthetic biology and gain of function research. Gain of function research is genetic engineering, which is where you take a bug that occurs naturally and you confer on it properties that it doesn't naturally have, either making it more lethal, more transmissible in humans, or resistant to vaccines, resistant to drugs. So you could take an avian influenza virus, for example, and bird flu does not transmit easily between humans because the receptors in the respiratory tract of a bird is different to that in a human. So the viruses that are adapted to birds do not transmit easily in humans. You do occasionally get humans getting very sick with bird flu. They're usually poultry handlers or people who are in very close contact with birds, sick or dead birds. And but if those viruses switch their receptor affinity to the human respiratory tract, then they can be easily transmitted between humans. And that's really the first gain of function research that got a lot of attention in 2011 and 12, which was when scientists were trying to take these bird flu viruses that didn't normally transmit easily between humans and make them super transmissible.
The first time I heard about this research, I couldn't believe that it was allowed to go on because of the potential impact of creating a pandemic. And I remember reading that article called "A Flu Risk Worth Taking." I think it might have been in the Washington Post from many years ago. And is it worth it? Are we actually getting any benefit from this dangerous research?
So it's kind of polarized the scientific community, but the problem is the debate has been held exclusively within the science and policy community, and it's been very tightly gated, and the public has not been informed what's at stake, when actually the public is the ultimate stakeholder here, whether it's to benefit from drugs and vaccines that are developed as a result of this research, or to be harmed by a pandemic that arose from a lab that they were never informed about and never consented to. You know, it also opens a whole lot of ethical questions that we haven't had to deal with before. And, you know, again, I think, you know, so we saw a huge global debate around it in 2011 and 12. There was a moratorium by the National Science NSABB, which had been formed in the US following 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. No other country had a body like that, so other countries weren't even thinking about it. And so there was a voluntary moratorium, but then there was a lot of lobbying from virologists and scientists and there was a petition that was signed by hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists saying that, you know, the future of humanity depended on us being able to do gain-of-function research, that this was critical to the future of humanity. And there was, at the same time, an opposing camp that was quite concerned, including people like Michael Osterholm from CIDRAP, University of Minnesota, and Donald Henderson, who was alive at the time. He has since passed away, but he was one of the leaders of smallpox eradication. So he and Mike Osterholm wrote a piece saying, warning of the dangers of this research and that the benefits certainly did not outweigh the risks, and they felt the risks outweighed the benefits. But in the end, the lobby group was so strong and much, much bigger of the virologists who wanted to do this kind of research, and the moratorium was lifted, the gates were opened, and we haven't looked back since. Well, there was another sort of a pause a few years later that went on till about 2017, but there was some notable exceptions of what does seem to be gain-of-function research, which occurred in that time, but somehow seemed to have got past that, the ban. And then there was a report commissioned by the US government to look at the risks and benefits. And after that, you know, it was like free for all. Everyone could do it. But other countries were way behind. And the point is, with these contagious pathogens, trying to control it in one country is not enough. It really needs to be done globally, and it needs to have a community voice.
I agree. And that's why I wanted to be part of this new organization, because my experience in talking to the lay public about this, even just dipping a toe in, is they're shocked. They completely had no idea that this was possible, that this research might be even going on in their backyard. And literally, you know, in Boston, you know, major cities, obviously we know about Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I think the other thing is that people don't understand how common lab leaks are and have been for a long time. And I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. They're very, very common, and the American Biosafety Association catalogues all the lab leaks they can document. You can go online and read it, and you'll be, you know, gobsmacked at the number of lab accidents that have occurred, some of which have been fatal, and some lab mishaps which have resulted in harm to a lot of people. So they are extremely common, and you've got to think about the vested interests of people who are laughing about it and saying, don't be ridiculous, that, this is a fantastic lab and we don't have any accidents. If someone's saying that, you've got to ask what's their vested interest and what are they protecting. But the truth is, the absolute fact is, they are very common. Lab leaks are very common, even in top-notch labs. And, the problem we have now is that the technology has come ahead in leaps and bounds that a lab leak 10 years ago wasn't as risky as it is now. So the risk that comes with a lab leak has amplified because of the sort of quantum advances in technology that we've seen in biology in the last decade particularly.
I think it's terrifying that some of these concerns that people like you have had and published about, we're watching the most devastating pandemic of our lifetime in front of us. It's not been settled that this was from a lab or not, or if it was natural. But I think there's deep concern that this was bioengineered, that this was created, and that there are many strains of COVID that seem very curious. In your book, you wrote about Omicron. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of Omicron being published and hitting the world?
Well, I don't make any sort of conclusions or definitive statements. I'm just saying, as an epidemiologist and observing what was happening, it was interesting to me that, first of all, that in late September 2020, just as vaccines were about to be rolled out, that at that time, and the original the vaccines were designed against the original strain, and they were actually very effective against the original strain. You could have controlled transmission quite well, even though there's waning of immunity with against the original strain, even against Alpha and Delta. But all of a sudden in late 2020, we saw multiple variants of concern arising simultaneously in different countries. So we saw Beta in South Africa, Alpha in the UK, arising in the UK, Gamma in South America, and then a bunch of other variants also popped up both in the US and Japan, which didn't become as dominant as those three. And the vaccines were a little less effective against those variants. And then in April, the Delta variant took off in India, and that was it. The vaccines still work reasonably against Delta, but less than against the original strain. And Delta was more lethal and more contagious, right? And then, but the vaccine still worked. And then, what I mentioned in my book is that somebody did some research to look at what sort of super mutant would be resistant to the vaccines. And they created they sort of engineered and created a super mutant virus with 20 plus mutations that conferred, resistance to the vaccine and, or a vaccine escape, as we call it. And that was published and now, there's a real pressure both from journals, from grant bodies and in the scientific community to publish everything open access, which means the researcher pays thousands of dollars when their paper is published, right? Which obviously means you're favouring wealthy countries and wealthy researchers to get their paper published. So the cost of the publishing is borne by the researcher, and in return, the journal makes it open access. So anyone can read it and get those methods. And, in 2017, we saw, just to go off track a little bit, a Canadian scientist created from scratch, and this is synthetic biology, which is different from gain of function research, which is where you can just manufacture a virus from scratch in a lab, right? They created a virus that's very, very closely related to smallpox in a lab in 2017. And it's published in an open access journal. So anyone could look at that. And if they knew the few differences between that virus and smallpox, they could make smallpox in a lab, right?
Amazing.
So, but interestingly, that paper was published in September, I think, the one about the super mutant. And then in November, all of a sudden, the Omicron variant took off in South Africa. And the paper wasn't from South Africa, it was from the US. So I'm not saying that was a lab leak. I'm just saying, and Omicron had all those mutations plus more. So to me, it's like, you know,
Yeah.
to me, that's curious.
You sort of touched on another important piece of creating viruses in a lab, which is that they can be used for nefarious purposes. The public doesn't know that these things can, like you wrote about the Salmonella outbreak in 1984, and it was, is it called the Rajneesh cult?
Yeah.
And that was fascinating to me.
So the Rajneesh outbreak is really interesting to me, and I use it in teaching as well to students when we teach about bioterrorism, because it kind of illustrates all the problems we have with biosecurity and public health, in that this was a deliberate attack that was denied and said to be natural by the public health authorities, even when there was, you know, when the evidence clearly suggested there was something very unusual about it. And then once it was irrefutably proven that it was unnatural, and that was quite by accident almost a year later, and I'll go into the story in a minute, that was silenced and covered up. So the public didn't know anything about it for another 10 years. And it just has all the features of what we see with unnatural outbreaks, which are common, which do occur, unnatural outbreaks, either through lab leaks or deliberate release, or failure to inactivate vaccines properly, as in the case of the Qatar polio incident in the 1950s, but also the 1977 Russian flu epidemic.
What are the hallmarks? So you said it sort of had some hallmarks of the unnatural origin.
So this outbreak happened in the 1980s in a city in Oregon, and people started getting sick with gastro, right, at the same time. And it was quite a large outbreak. There were over 700 people that were sick. And so the local public health authorities called in the CDC, because it was very big compared to what they were used to. And so the CDC and the local public health authorities quickly ascertained that everyone who got sick had eaten out at restaurants, but not at the same restaurant. There were at least 10 different restaurants involved. So what would be the reason why people eating at 10 different restaurants would get sick? You'd think, okay, maybe the water supply was contaminated, maybe the milk or the eggs or some common ingredient used in the restaurant. But they investigated all of that. The water supply was fine. There was no common ingredient that could explain the outbreak. You know, when they tested all the commonly used ingredients, they were negative for any bacteria or pathogens. The other common feature they had was all of the restaurants had a salad bar. But some of those restaurants had a public dining room and private rooms, and the private rooms served the same food as a public dining room, but only people who ate at the public dining room got sick, and only people who ate from the salad bars got sick, right? And they also tested the sanitation and said it was actually pretty good. They couldn't find any glaring problems with sanitation at any of these restaurants, and certainly not that all 10 restaurants had bad sanitation. And yet the public health authorities said it was an outbreak due to unsanitary food handling. But there was no evidence to suggest that. The sanitation was fine. There was no contaminated ingredient that they found. They couldn't explain why people who ate in the private dining rooms didn't get sick when they were eating the same food. And also, biochemically, the strain of Salmonella, which was the cause of the outbreak, that they found was very unusual. It wasn't the same, it wasn't similar to the Salmonella strains that generally caused outbreaks, natural outbreaks. So it had an unusual biochemical characteristic. So it was an unusual strain that they hadn't seen before, and they couldn't explain why it was so different to the other salmonellas they normally saw. So there were lots and lots of red flags. So what could be the explanations? Oh, it's obvious, you know, to even a child, I think, that one of the explanations could be somebody contaminated the salad bars. And there was actually a politician called Jim Weaver who said, I think the Rajneeshis did this. It's a bioterrorism attack. And the public health authorities shouted him down. Then he went to the media to try and air his concerns. He was ridiculed and made to look like a conspiracy theorist in the media. Then 6 months later, Rajneesh confessed that his cult had done this, but it wasn't believed. This is a bit I'd really press home, that even a confession isn't believed. So what hope is there to ever identify an unnatural outbreak when, one, the question's never asked, it's just always assumed to be natural. Two, even a confession isn't believed. And three, there's so much cover-up that goes on even after it's uncovered. So he confessed, wasn't believed. Then a full 12 months later, the FBI was doing a raid on the ranch for immigration purposes. And they accidentally stumbled onto this bioweapons lab on the ranch, which had all kinds of much more dangerous pathogens in it. Also had the identical salmonella strain that caused the outbreak strain. They were growing it in the lab, right? So it turned out that, and you know, that's the other thing we see in this field. People live within a narrow bound of possibilities, and they only hear either what they want to hear or what they're told in the mass media or in mass communication. So often people say, you know, oh, it can't be true. You know, that can't be true, therefore I don't believe it, you know. And we saw this active kind of cover up and silencing of the truth, and a refusal to even consider it by the public health authorities, which shows there's a kind of hardwired recalcitrance and these are not virologists, these are public health people, right, who investigate outbreaks.
Why is this? Why? I mean, we're watching it now with the COVID pandemic. There's this enormous fight about whether this was natural or unnatural. And I'm curious.
Well, I think in medicine and public health, we're not trained to ask the question, is it natural or unnatural?
Oh.
Everything is assumed to be natural. So that's the starting point. You're not even trained to ask the question. Whereas really, and you can't answer the question with science or medicine, not entirely, partly maybe. The question needs a forensic investigation. It's very similar to the kind of skills that you use in intelligence or policing or, you know, in a homicide investigation. You've got to investigate, you've got to look for motives, you've got to look for different kinds of clues, and you've got to piece all the evidence together. No virologist or scientist can answer the question. No, absolutely not. You need a lot more. You need the satellite intelligence, the signals intelligence, the motive. And in this particular outbreak, the motive ended up being that the Rajneeshis were trying to get control of land in the area, and they were in dispute with the local council or the local authorities over the land. So they were running their own candidates in the local election so they could gain control over the county and use the land in the way they wished. Initially, they brought in thousands of homeless people from Portland and Seattle, I think, onto their ranch to get them to vote as Rajneeshis. And that kind of, the council, I think, overturned the legality of that. And then, or the county, and then they hatched this plan, which was, the plan was to poison the town's water supply just before the election. So people would be too sick to vote in the community, and only their people would go and vote. They'd win the election, they'd control the land, right? That was the motive. Now, that's a really bizarre motive, and of course nobody could guess a motive, but as an epidemiologist or a public health person, your job isn't to guess the motive. It's to just look at the information in front of you and say, does my hypothesis fit the facts? And the hypothesis they came up with didn't fit the facts. And if it didn't fit the facts, they should have talked to law enforcement agencies, you know, and said, something looks odd here, can you investigate? but they didn't. They just held it all as their exclusive domain to make a judgment. And when they didn't actually have the skills to make that judgment, as you saw, the ultimate proof came from the FBI finding a lab. That's forensic proof, right? Finding the lab with the outbreak strain. And it's just such an interesting case because you see that hardwired recalcitrance of not just scientists and virologists, but the whole medical and public health community to even considering that an outbreak could be unnatural. And then when it's found, why did they cover it up? There was no government involvement. There was no lab leak. This was like a straight out act of bioterrorism. Why did it need to be covered up? Because the thing was that cult, and I'd recommend people watch this documentary on Netflix called Wild Wild Country, which is just, it's riveting. I kind of binge watched it over one weekend, and it's got like 12 episodes. Because I'd already studied it, and then studied the outbreak, and then the documentary came out, so I was super interested, and it was just fascinating. Really, and it's quite a gripping documentary. But they did things like, if they didn't like someone or they had individual enemies, they would give them boxes of chocolates in which they'd injected poison into the chocolates from under the bottom of the box, tiny needles. They'd give them poisoned lunch baskets and water. So there could have been a lot of people who were actually harmed at the time who never knew because it was silenced and covered up for 12 years. So by not telling people, guys, we got it wrong, this was an attack, people should have been told right then, because people could have then made sense of things that had happened to them individually where they might have been targeted by this cult, because this cult was targeting people, to understand that, oh my God, I got sick, or my husband died, at that time, and maybe the Rajneeshis poisoned them.
And this was a domestic, cult. So it wasn't even, I lived in Manhattan during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and there was this sense of it would only come from another country. It wouldn't have been here on our soil, or it would be extremely rare and unlikely that anybody would harm you from your own country, in your own backyard. You talked a lot in the book, and I learned a lot from you about, information warfare. This has been such a pressing concern of mine during the COVID pandemic. And from the beginning, it was clearly airborne. It was then covered up. You were told, wash your hands really well. If you wear a mask, you could actually get yourself sicker because you'll be fiddling with it. There was this craziest stuff I ever saw in my entire life. And there was Biogen. There was that conference in Boston in February where dozens and dozens of people got sick. And it was so obvious to me, who's not an expert in airborne diseases and epidemiology, that this was in the air. People were breathing this in. They were not all touching the same spoon at the buffet. So I wondered why. It was such a harm to the whole landscape of public health to do this. And it's all been, in my opinion, exposed. And it created so much confusion and so much division. Why was the public not leveled with in the beginning? And why were they told to wash their hands? Why were they not told to wear N95s once they were available, and told the truth about cloth and surgical masks not being very protective? Like, what happened?
So I think, I've got a whole chapter in the book called The Fuss About Face Masks. And this is actually a much longer standing issue, this polarization between masking and anti-masking. And it goes back to SARS in 2003, where, so the infection prevention control community, which is hospital infection control experts, their remit is patient safety, that the discipline has grown out of patient safety. So they are used to looking after the safety of patients and protecting patients from getting wound infections or getting nasty antimicrobial bugs, while they're in hospital. And often the person to blame is the health worker because they might have forgotten to wash their hands, or, So these people are expert in things that involve hand washing and in antimicrobial resistance. whereas the whole science of airborne infections requires a more multidisciplinary approach, because you've got to consider airflow, ventilation, building design, a whole range of things that are far outside of the knowledge of medical experts. But unfortunately, every time there's a serious pandemic, it's the IPC community that makes guidelines. And, you know, I don't want to go into details about, you know, vested interests and why. Information warfare is broader in that it's saying, you know, and is saying that medicine has a long history of using information warfare. Prestigious journals have a long history of platforming information warfare. It's been seen through tobacco science, through climate change, through the whole mask debacle, and through the origins of COVID. You know, there's been far fewer papers that have been published that have, you know, presented evidence supporting a lab leak than there have, studies on sort of proposing a natural origin. So there's this heavy bias in the scientific journals. I won't name which ones are the worst offenders, but these are prestigious journals and they control the narrative. And it's only by looking at history, I think, that you can look at the present and think about what's happening in the present. And one of the other problems, which is kind of amplified during the pandemic, is a sort of political polarization of narrative and the kind of tribalism of human beings, where, you know, and in the US it's the red and blue thing, that by saying that you think the lab leak is a viable hypothesis, you're suddenly aligning yourself with some people who might actually be not the kind of people that you align themselves with, you know, sort of people who believe certain political ideologies, and, you know, maybe people who, you know, who don't, I won't comment further on that. But that's the problem of information warfare, that people are so tribalistic by nature that they don't want to believe something that the other tribe believes. So, but sometimes truth, you know, my view is that you need to look at what everybody is saying, regardless of what you feel about them or what tribe they belong to, because sometimes you can get bits of truth everywhere.
That's right.
And you've got to think about the facts objectively and try and put them together in a way that makes sense, rather than just blindly follow a particular political line because you've got no capability of critical thought, you know. And people do find it quite hard to step out of those tribal alliances, I think.
I agree. You know, I hear so much from the people that are on the side of COVID having a natural origin, and saying that it came from a wet market in Wuhan, from a bat, potentially. Many animals have been sort of thrown around where they didn't sell bats in December of 2019. And yet what happened at the military games is very, very curious to me. In October 2019, it seems like there was a major outbreak of some mysterious pneumonia. I don't know. I mean, I read articles from every country pretty much. I think there were 10,000 athletes from 100 countries, and it was just the perfect place to disseminate a virus all over the entire world. What do you make of the military games?
I think that's another piece of information that fits into a bigger picture that is much more about looking at the genome sequence of the virus. That's just one piece of the picture. You know, as I said, the skills to investigate the origins of an outbreak, and there is a whole science around investigating the origin of outbreaks, which most scientists commenting about it are not aware of. So again, they think it's their exclusive domain to comment on the origin based on a fraction of the information that's required. So you need to look at all lines of evidence and put it all together and look at the big picture. So that includes all kinds of intelligence. You know, I would like to see the serological studies done on stored serum from that period of time between October and December 2019, anyone who had blood taken during that time, to look at their antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 from athletes who went. But has that been published? No. There's been a serosurvey published out of China which suggests there wasn't any serological evidence of SARS-CoV-2, but, you know, that depends on where you sample. If you went and sampled in Beijing or Shanghai, you know, you probably won't find anything. It depends on who you sample. China's a big country and how you do that sampling. So, but there are serological studies that suggest it was circulating in the US in December and in Europe in November. So there's other lines of evidence that it arose well before late December. And also the reports of people getting sick in the lab at Wuhan. And just the basic fact that this outbreak arose in proximity to two major labs that were both doing research on coronaviruses. Yeah. Are we supposed to just say that's a conspiracy theory? Zheng Li and her colleagues released a sequence of the closest known bat relative virus to SARS-CoV-2 after the pandemic started. And that was a virus that they were working on, or they had in the lab there.
Yeah, there's so many questions. And I hate the term conspiracy theorist and quacks. And I don't like all these terms that people use to discredit rational questions, you know. And again, it goes back to your book.
It's an easy way to shut. Yeah, it's an easy way to shut down discussion.
It is. And I mean, I come from having a very severe case of chronic Lyme, which got me into this whole world of writing a book about pathogens and persistent pathogens, including COVID, and taking such an interest in this topic. But, you know, Lyme too was completely, you know, Lyme was known to be a really severe infectious disease. It was on the cover of Newsweek magazine in 1989. And they said, essentially in this article, there was an ID doc who said, if it wasn't for HIV, this would be the most horrifying infectious disease that's spreading globally. And people were so sick. We knew at that time it was congenital. It was persistent. It could cause dementia, arthritis, RA, you know, all these things. And then it was completely covered up. So now if you talk about, and I was in heart failure from it. So I was extremely sick and near death, and I knew nothing about any of this, the politics of medicine and infectious diseases. I was in the midst of a music career at the time. So, you know, you learn these things the hard way. And when I saw COVID hit the world, I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be politically and even medically, with all the chronic illness, with persistence, it's going to be so similar. And, you know, here we are. I'm curious what you think about COVID. I'm wondering what you think about where we are now.
Well, I think we're in a very bad place because COVID is a chronically disabling illness that attacks multiple organ systems, the brain, the heart, the lungs, the immune system, the kidneys, pretty much any organ system you can think of. And of course, it's a highly vascular disease, so it affects your small blood vessels everywhere. And there's so many studies now, huge body of evidence showing that, you know, your risk of having a heart attack, a stroke, a blood clot, a pulmonary embolus, cognitive impairment, dementia even, is increased after COVID for, you know, at least 12 months after having COVID. And but there's silence around that from a public health perspective, because public health agencies around the world have kind of gone down that narrative of it's just a cold, it's over now, forget about it, get infected, it's good for you. So it's like, you know, collectively as a world, we've cut off our nose to spite our face. Maybe that was the intention. I don't know, you know, but it just seems really, so it's like, on the one hand, there was aggressive messaging telling people it was over and it was mild and it was nothing to worry about. And then it's like, oops. So there's silence. Nobody's coming out and saying you need to prevent yourself getting infected. You could end up with heart failure at the age of 35. You know, we don't know. There's enough warning signs to suggest you should be extremely worried and cautious, and you shouldn't be exposing your kids to infection over and over again.
Yeah.
But there's just silence.
There's silence, and there's so much chronic illness, and there's so much death around us. I'm seeing like young health. I have a friend who's a pediatrician, had 2 young healthy kids in her practice die of infections that would not have killed them before, most likely, she feels, before COVID infected them a couple of times. And that's, it's terrifying. It's terrifying to watch what's happening and to watch the lack of reaction from public health and the media.
And I think, in a lot of instances, I think, people are disposable and cheap. If your workforce is affected, well, you can import cheap people from elsewhere to do the job. We're considered disposable assets, so if you haven't got enough nurses, you can just import them from somewhere else. If you haven't got enough people to run your factory, you set up your factory somewhere else where there are, abundant people. So we are not being valued as it's quite depressing really to watch what's unfolding. And really we're seeing a lot of section of the community who've kind of bought into this narrative, cheering on their own demise and disablement. Yes. Which is really sad.
The other thing I see is people that are developing a lot of very concerning symptoms and not attributing them to COVID. And when you say, maybe you should look into that. And also we know COVID reactivates other latent infections. And I would be wanting to know what's causing my issues. And it's like, no, it's not COVID. There's that whole thing, which I find so bizarre.
So when you've got aggressive government propaganda telling you it's nothing, of course people are going to believe it's nothing and find alternative explanations for why, they're getting early signs of dementia, or they're short of breath when walking up the stairs, or they've got serious other infections. We know there's heaps of data showing that COVID kind of makes your immune system dysfunctional for a considerable period of time. And we don't know how that's going to play out with repeated infections. Is it going to be, a long-term chronic issue of impaired immunity as a result of COVID? Or is it going to, it's just at the moment, the evidence that there is very concerning. And we know that other infections like measles, for example, do cause immune paresis. So when you get measles, for about 2 to 3 years afterwards, you're at increased risk of virtually every other infection. Kind of paralyzes your immune system for a period of time and then you recover. That's been well studied and that's well accepted by those who know about measles. Although I have to say I was on a teleconference with some virologists once, and when I mentioned that, they said, oh no, measles doesn't do that. And I had to provide them all the references. It's like people live in their own little bubble, and if they don't know something, they think it's not true. Knowledge is out there if you care to seek it out, reputable knowledge. There is a lot of disinformation and disreputable knowledge out there as well. That's not knowledge, it's disinformation. And it's hard for individuals but in terms of medical people and public health people, knowledge is out there. If you don't know it, then you're ignorant, but don't tell other people who do know that it's not true.
I've been shocked by the public health people and the social media. I call them like the soldiers for the different political administrations, spreading this kind of health disinformation in the middle of COVID. It's been shocking to me to see how many of them went along with it. And they know what they're saying isn't true. And I guess what they get out of it is political favor, or it's hard the stakes are just so high that I don't understand that kind of behavior at all on any level.
I think, I've sort of been wondering in myself, and I think partly, doctors and public health experts, they're human beings like everybody else. And I think partly they've been brainwashed too. It's like they hear this propaganda over and over again. So they too kind of start to believe it, that it's mild, it's fine. The government's telling us it's okay to get reinfected. It's good to get reinfected. So it must be the way to go. It's okay. And so then you can form alternative explanations for things that aren't quite gelling with that theory, right?
Yeah.
You can send off when your patient comes to see you and they're fatigued, when in actual fact they might be having heart failure,
Yeah.
you can send them off to do graded exercise, telling them they'll fix it, Yeah. So I think there is a degree of kind of that medical expert professionals have also been brainwashed by the propaganda and kind of just going along with with this mass disinformation.
Yeah.
Or they can't quite, get their heads around it, or, I've observed that personally in some people. Some people obviously are more calculated and cunning and deliberately deceitful. But I think there is a lot of just general brainwashing of medical professionals.
Yes, I would agree. It's the ones that know better that I find so enraging, because they have so much influence and so much power. Yeah. And I know because my parents call me, right? They're watching the evening news and they tell me I don't need to wear a mask anymore. I had my boosters. Well, my dad got a booster, his fourth shot, and a month later was extremely sick with COVID and would have been hospitalized if the hospital wasn't so full. My dad is healthy and immune competent. So I'm just enraged about putting innocent, well-meaning people in harm's way like this. And I can't stand it. Yeah.
The other thing that's really disturbed me, I've worked in vaccinology for 20 years, a long time, including at our National Centre for Immunisation Research. So I understand the field very well. And I've been dealing with the anti-vaccine lobby for a very long time, and they have a set of classic arguments they use, which is natural infection is good for you, for your child, get infected, it's good for you, build up natural immunity. Vaccines are bad for you, they're dangerous, they're evil, it's a big pharma conspiracy to make money and, harm you. And they've got a stock standard line of arguments that they use. And now we are seeing mainstream pediatricians and doctors, not so much in the US actually, but in the UK, in Australia and other countries that kind of slavishly follow the UK, we're seeing a whole swath of mainstream pediatricians and doctors, some of who are on government vaccine advisory committees, saying exactly the same thing. They're mimicking anti-vaccine rhetoric.
I think that's because there's been so much lying through the entire pandemic about everything, including the vaccines. Yeah. And I don't think that that helped anything to say pretend these were sterilizing when they weren't, to say you wouldn't get long COVID when you could. And I know tons of people that have gotten vaccinated and got long COVID. And so public health has done a huge disservice to the entire vaccine program, in my opinion, by just not being run about everything from COVID being airborne to every single major aspect of what.
In Australia, we weren't allowed to get a bivalent booster till just a couple of weeks ago if you'd already had 4 doses. Most people who got a third or a fourth dose got it in around March to May last year, right? So that whole period through the Omicron waves that came last year, nobody could get a booster. Very few people did, because they've had this fear of vaccines instilled to them by mainstream doctors and officials.
Do you think we'll get a sterilizing vaccine? Do you think we'll get a vaccine that stops transmission?
Anything's possible, but when we take away these emergency declarations and de-emphasize it and try to paint COVID as just like the flu, then all the research effort that we saw in that first year, which was phenomenal research effort, all just falls by the wayside. There's no funding, there's no incentive. So what we're going to see is less research and development to develop those. I say absolutely yes. If we could do that in less than a year in 2020, of course we can develop either sterilizing vaccines or universal vaccines that are variant proof. Yes, it's absolutely possible.
Do you think we
need the will and the motivation and the infrastructure and support to get that done?
understand. Do you think that we'll have antivirals and post-exposure prophylaxis?
So we've already got antivirals that
You're talking about Paxlovid?
Any antiviral, right? If you use a lot of it, you'll generate antiviral resistance. Hasn't happened so much with the what's called the neuraminidase inhibitor class of flu antivirals. So with the flu, the first generation of antivirals called the adamantanes, pretty much all flu is resistant to those now, right? But the oseltamivir and the zanamivir, which are the neuraminidase inhibitors, there's not a lot of resistance, and those have been used for more than a decade. Maybe not used at a mass scale, but certainly quite widely used around the world. So it's not always the case that you'll generate major antiviral resistance, but there is a concern, particularly with the molnupiravir. But even the molnupiravir reduces viral load, accelerates viral clearance. We know now with the Paxlovid, it reduces the risk of long COVID. And, if you're kind of abandoning people and telling them to live with it, at least make, antivirals available so that people
and make them so they can clear the virus. I mean,
go back to work and not, you want to be able to go back to work and not infect all your colleagues.
Yes. Yeah, I'm concerned about, my main concern is long COVID at this point. My main concern is viral persistence and all the things that you mentioned about the multisystemic disease and vascular issues.
I think viral persistence is certainly an important part of long COVID.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who deny that, but we've seen that study out of NIH, which proves it, that there is viral persistence in all kinds of organs long after the acute infection. And if you've got viral persistence, then that could be keeping on triggering the a dysfunctional immune response, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and I've heard anecdotally I think there are studies now looking at antivirals for long COVID symptoms, but I think that's potentially another application of antivirals.
Yeah. I think they are studying Paxlovid too for long COVID. I don't know how it's going. I've heard mixed results so far, and I'm holding out hope. I do hope that we get something that can help us prevent infection other than an N95.
And it may end up being like HIV, where you need multi-drug therapy to prevent the resistance and still keep the drugs effective. That may be the longer term way this evolves, that you're going to need multi-drug therapy for COVID and long COVID.
Yeah, that's my understanding. So are we, will we ever get out of this in our lifetime? This is a question people ask me all the time. Like, is this ever going to end? I don't see an end, but I want to know, you're the expert.
I think it's unlikely to end, but we could end up in a much better position to be able to limit or mitigate the damage that it causes. I'm particularly worried about the future generations, the young people and the kids. They've been kind of dismissed as, they don't get it, Miley, forget about them, we'll just worry about older people. But what's it going to do to our children of today? Are they going to be, presenting with heart failure at the age of 20 or 30? Because they've had COVID 15 times before they get to that age? Are they going to be presenting with dementia at the age of 40? Yeah. We don't know. But there are certainly enough warning signs to say this is a multi-system, potentially degenerative virus that's going to attack organ systems. We should be being extremely precautionary and safeguarding our children from the chronic harms that repeated infection may cause them.
I agree. People don't know the history of the Spanish flu, and they don't realize the history of SARS-1, which was that people became very chronically ill and also got worse over time. There's this new narrative where long COVID resolves after a few months. And maybe for some people it does, but for a lot of people, they're getting worse. And that's my concern, is just that there's...
And each infection can worsen the long COVID symptoms. Yeah.
It's just logic. You don't want compounded infections. You don't want multiple hits. You're still kind of recovering from the last one and you get knocked down again. How does it even make sense to pretend that that's not dangerous.
If you think about the big picture and everything that's happened has encouraged mass transmission and mass harm. But post that initial phase of enthusiasm for vaccines, we've seen a sort of abandonment of public health measures with that, and we've seen a kind of hysteria around public health measures, kind of conflating any public health measure with a lockdown, when nobody's advocating lockdowns anymore. But there's kind of this hysteria, the minute you say, let's have clean air, it's like lockdown, what? Why is it, why don't you want clean air? But there are actually people out there campaigning against clean air.
It's expensive. Nobody wants to pay for
about people who want clean air. I mean, do they not want clean water either? Should we all go and live in Flint, Michigan? All of the front-facing people who are pushing this, are they just useful idiots for a bigger agenda? I don't know.
It seems that way. I mean, it seems that way. And, I always think that if people really understood the risk, they wouldn't send their kids to school in an unventilated classroom. The parents would be raising hell about this. And by keeping them in the dark and by creating this disinformation campaign about, you don't need cleaner air, it's clean enough, whatever. You can send your kid to school with a clear conscience. And you can go back to the office and you can go to Macy's and spend money. I don't know what else.
I think parents as well have kind of bought into the narrative and got hysterical about lockdowns and kind of bought into that, all the damage done to children by the lockdowns thing, are now vested in a position. And I think for them, cognitively actually accepting that this is harmful will be a very difficult position to get to. So I think a lot of people are still in denial and kind of justifying their, trivialization of the disease.
Yeah. So any words of encouragement or wisdom for us moving through this next phase of the pandemic?
I think there's always hope in development of technologies that'll help us to mitigate the transmission or the effect of infection. And that includes things like germicidal UVC and ways of making indoor environments safer. I think in time, a lot of these things will come, and maybe it'll take a lot of economic harm before those things start coming into being accepted as normal and part of our lives. If you look back through history, things like smoking, you could smoke on aeroplanes, you could smoke in the office. That's been a huge cultural shift, right, to accept clean indoor air when it comes to smoking. So we have seen major shifts occur. The other thing I think around, get to that in a minute, but around gain of function research, which is not the question you asked me. I think we'll see new drugs and vaccines being developed as well. I think we'll see other emerging infections come into the picture and kind of destabilize things again. We saw a very unusual and unprecedented monkeypox epidemic in 2022. We've got concerns about H5N1 avian flu in, mammalian populations like sea lions. And
are you concerned about that emerging among humans?
It's always a threat, because that's kind of been the real focus of pandemic preparedness, has always been around, or at least since the mid-2000s has been around, since about 2005 has been around H5N1. That the fear that it will mutate and acquire the receptor affinity for human respiratory tract and become transmissible. So we're hearing from WHO right now that, it's probably wasn't transmitted from the child to the father in Cambodia, but they said that about SARS-CoV-2 as well, didn't they? That it wasn't transmitted between humans. So I think the jury's out, we'll have to see. But the mammals dying off in big quantities, like the seals in Peru, they're thinking it looks like mammal-to-mammal transmission, which is not been seen before. And then the mink in Europe. So So I think we'll see other emerging infections. We are in the era of what I call a biological winter, where we'll be seeing a lot of these epidemics coming rapidly, one after another. That's what I think. So even if we get everything sorted with COVID, I don't think that's the end of the story.
And when you see these things as your first instinct, think this is natural or unnatural?
Yeah, I always ask the question. In the era of we live in now, with the technology that's available, and I think what I'm hoping is that people in the community will become aware of what is at stake, what technology actually is out there and what it can do, right? Both genetic engineering and synthetic biology. But along with that, other technology that is kind of complementary technology, like engineering of human super soldiers. That's already happening in the US, in the UK, in China probably, but it's not a secret that it's happening in the US and the UK. So you've got, on the one hand, engineering of human beings to be stronger, fitter, better, resist pain, fight longer, etc. But that opens the door for all kinds of engineering, including by hostile states to use genetic engineering to weaken human populations, right? Yeah. So there's a potential to use this technology against human beings in their own genetic makeup and constitution. And then coupled with that, so the technology is present today for a bad actor to, you can actually eradicate a species using genetic engineering technology. You could weaken an entire population of, people using currently available genetic technology, and at the same time you could develop a biological weapon that could be released into that population as a double whammy. So you weaken their immunity, you hit them with something, and nobody would even know it's an attack because no one believes it. Yeah. No one knows what technology is out there, how mind-blowing it actually is. Right. It's all happened very rapidly. It's escalated. That the technology has kind of increased exponentially in the last decade after the development of CRISPR-Cas9, which is the kind of precision gene editing technology which has been available in the last 10 years, and then the synthetic biology methods to make viruses like smallpox, and I can tell you, if we see the re-emergence of smallpox in the world, to me, it's going to be, synthetically, a man-made act. But the narrative will be, it arose from corpses that defrosted in the Siberian permafrost or something like that, right? I can tell you the narrative it's going to be accompanied with it. And then there's other technologies, like did you know you could 3D print biological materials? You can 3D print cells, living cells. And what I would like to see is the community becoming aware of what capabilities are out there in terms of biological technology and having a voice in how we regulate this technology to ensure that we don't wipe out the human species for our own survival. I don't think the answer is going to come from scientists, as I say in my book, because many of them have too many vested interests, and that tends to be the majority group. There are a minority who are sort of concerned. And I think the answer will come from the community being empowered with knowledge, the knowledge to drive change. That knowledge can drive election results in democracies. We've seen that with climate change. People have a high degree of awareness of climate change in the community, and it's the community absolutely that's driven any positive steps we've seen in climate change mitigation. It's not scientists, it's not governments, it's the community. It's when governments know that their chance of getting elected depends on, paying lip service at least to climate change, they will listen, because the community voice is very powerful. I really believe in the power of the people, and I think we need people empowered with knowledge, not in a crazy and destructive way, but enough to know, to be reasonably informed, to understand what's at stake in what's going on around them. And then accompanying that, we need to see major cultural shifts in the way this research is done. And, in one of my papers where I talk about the ethics of gain-of-function research, I mentioned the example of clinical trials. People think that it's too hard to change the way we do medical research. Yes, it's hard, but it's not impossible. And you just need to look at clinical trials. Like when I started doing clinical trial research, there was no need to register your trial. Anyone could just do a trial, get it published in a journal, right? No questions asked.
Yeah.
And then around 2007, 2008, that changed from a concerted and longer effort to register and publicly register all clinical trials. And the reason for that was that particularly pharma, but other non-pharma as well, who were doing trials, were censoring or hiding, unfavorable results of trials. Right. And not letting people know about it. So there was a real bias in what was coming out in the journals.
Yeah.
So to make everything open and transparent, you can't get a clinical trial published today in a proper medical journal unless it's registered before the trial starts. So you have to register what exactly are you studying, what's the research question, how are you going to do it, what are your methods, and how are you measuring it, how are you going to do it, etc. And then that's there as a public record, and there's a number of clinical trials registries around the world. And I was active in research at the time this change came in. So it was quite a, hard change to bring in, but it was adopted universally, globally, which means that major journals, major granting bodies, all of them comply with the requirement. They require you to register a clinical trial. Ethics committee won't approve it unless it's registered. A journal won't publish it unless it's registered. We could get to that same point with gain of function and synthetic biology.
Yeah.
It just requires a concerted will and effort to change the way we think about it and the kind of free rein that we've given to scientists until now.
And I think the first step is really what you're here doing, which is educating the public about it. I just think that once the awareness is created, it will be a lot easier to get the public on board and to be vocal about this. And I think that's really, really needed. I'm so worried about the future of our kids and seeing all these emerging infectious diseases and seeing what COVID has done to the world. I don't want this to happen again. And I feel like the public should have a say in what happens to us.
Absolutely, I agree with that. But I have to qualify that, this kind of research is important. There is a role for gain of function and synthetic biology, but it needs to be regulated and it needs to be open and transparent. There has to be a mechanism for public consultation and it needs to be recorded in public view what's happening where, and journals shouldn't be publishing anything that doesn't. Of course, not everyone is doing the research to get it published in a journal, right? That's the problem.
Yeah.
But that will be one step. So I'm not against the research per se. I'm just saying that there is a substantial risk involved and we have only considered the benefits and we've kind of whitewashed over the risks until now. We need to have a more balanced approach to managing that risk, and there's lots of things we could do to improve the outcome for humanity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I am so appreciative of your time and all of your knowledge and expertise. I love your book. It's called Dark Winter. This absolutely mesmerizing expose of the whole entire landscape of biosecurity and biowarfare and natural versus unnatural. I've learned a lot in these last couple of weeks reading your book, and thank you for just sharing so much with the world.
Yeah, it's written for lay people, for ordinary people. It's not technical. It's written in a way that anyone can understand and appreciate what the risk is that we're facing. And it uses kind of historical examples, so you can't just say, oh, that can't be true. So it gives you example after example of what's happened in the past, so you can put that in context and think, oh my God, they really did that.
Yeah, I've had many of those moments reading your book, and it's been really, really a wake-up call for me to understand the depths of what can be done, what has been done, and how important it is for all of us to rise to the occasion and try to put some parameters around this research so that we have a safer future and protect our kids and our grandkids. So thank you.
And Biosafety Now is a great initiative. I definitely, I was glad to join. I was glad it was formed, glad to join it and believe in its mission.
Absolutely, me too. So biosafetynow.org if anybody wants to check it out. And Raina, where can we get your book, Dark Winter?
You can order it off online booksellers like Amazon.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure, Dana. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Ticktective, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. For more information or to get involved, please visit us at bayarealyme.org.